indicated the other day they want to take a break at 3, so figured I'd better ask. You ready to have him come back in?
Yes, sir.
Bench ready to have him come back in?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Try this out when y'all are ready.
Yes. Put away, is that right? Or you still have it?
It's away, correct. Yes, it's put away.
Okay, great. So now we're moving on to State's Exhibit 83. You can take a look at that.
Both the manila envelope and the cardboard box inside have the lab number, the item number, and my initials on it, as well as the bullet inside. It's engraved on that as well.
And did you have an opportunity to compare State's Exhibit 83, the projectile recovered from Sergeant Morales' dash, to the defendant's firearm, Exhibit 49?
Yes.
And did you go through the same process you described earlier in your testimony?
Correct.
And what conclusion did you reach?
I was able to determine that the bullet in States 83 was fired in the pistol in States 49.
All right, I'll trade you now. I'm going to come there with State's Exhibit 80 in evidence.
The lab number, item number, and initials written on the manila envelope, the cardboard box, and the bullet inside the box.
All right. Now the exhibit states 80 that was recovered from Sergeant Morales' passenger door. Did you compare it to states exhibit 49, the defendant's gun?
Yes.
And did you reach a conclusion?
Yes, the bullet in states exhibit 80 was fired in the pistol in states exhibit 49.
Lastly, I'll have you look at state 62, please. That's also in evidence.
Again, the manila envelope, the 35 millimeter film canister inside, and the bullet inside the canister all have the lab number, the item number, and the initials written and or engraved on it.
And were you able to compare State Exhibit 62, the projectile recovered from Sergeant Morales' bulletproof vest, and compare it to the State Exhibit 49, the defendant's gun?
Yes.
And what conclusion did you reach?
The bullet in states exhibit 62 was fired in the pistol in states exhibit 49.
No other questions, John?
Please. Hello.
How you doing?
All right.
Good. Okay, so we've been learning today about how a gun is actually able to carry more, I'm going to use the correct phrase here, more casings, or more cartridges, bullets basically, right, unfired bullets. How they're able to carry more cartridges than what their magazine actually allows. So if you could, take me through step by step on how somebody can do that with a gun. So for example, Mr. Tisdale's gun has a magazine that holds a maximum of 10, right?
Correct.
Okay. Tell me about how that gun could actually be loaded with the +1 to make it be able to hold more than what the magazine allows.
The top of the pistol there's an area, it's called the slide. Basically, an individual, if you pull the slide to the rear and let it go forward, that cocks the firearm. And if there's a magazine in there, what it will happen is it will strip a cartridge off the top of the magazine and chamber it. So now basically the pistol's ready to fire. You can, basically before you insert the magazine, you could pull the slide to the rear, manually drop a cartridge into the chamber, let the slide come forward, and then insert the completely filled magazine, and that's how you would get an extra cartridge in the firearm.
Is there another common method of putting that extra +1 cartridge in there?
I suppose you could take a fully loaded magazine, or even just one in the magazine, insert the magazine into the well, pull the slide to the rear, have it chambered that way, remove the magazine, then completely fill the magazine and then reinsert the magazine. You could also do it that way.
Is one easier than the other?
I guess that would be a personal preference.
All right. So let's assume that somebody doesn't know that either of those methods or tricks to be able to put the +1 capacity. If somebody doesn't know that, what's the most amount of cartridges that could be held in this gun?
The magazine that fit in that pistol in States 49 held 10 cartridges.
Okay, so if they didn't know these couple of methods of adding a +1, the most that they'd be able to put into the most that they'd be able to carry around in the gun would be
10.
So let's talk about with this magazine fully loaded to the capacity of 10, and if you put the magazine into the gun, is the gun ready to fire?
No, you would have to pull the slide to the rear, which would, as it comes forward, pick a cartridge up and chamber it.
All right. So can you do that in advance of shooting?
Yes,
How far in advance?
indefinitely.
Now this is a Glock Model 30, correct?
Correct.
And the other firearms that you examined in this case were also, it was also a Glock, right?
Correct. It's a Glock 45 auto. Correct.
And do they both have, since it's the same manufacturer, do they both have similar safety features in the guns?
Yes, they're essentially the same. The main difference would be the size of the two.
And what are those safety features?
The most obvious one is an external trigger safety. If you look at the trigger on both of these firearms, there's a little area that protrudes on the front portion of the trigger where your finger would rest. Basically, as you pull the trigger to the rear, if you're holding it in the correct orientation, that little area gets depressed, and then that disengages an internal safety, which makes it capable of firing. If you were to, let's say, try to pull the trigger to the rear, like not touching that area, like on, let's say, the extreme edge, you would not be able to pull the trigger to the rear.
Okay. I'm going to show you. It's 49. So actually, are you able to see on this gun the type of trigger that you were just talking about?
No, the trigger safety or lock is obscuring it right now.
Okay, so on a, does it essentially look like it's two triggers, or what? Does the trigger look just like any other gun, or is it unique to this gun manufacturer?
There are other manufacturers that use a similar type safety, but if you were to look at the profile of the trigger, you have your typical trigger shape, that arced or curved shape, and there's essentially a notch in the middle of that trigger, and in the middle this extra little piece so you'd have your curve and the little piece protrudes from the profile view, and that piece pivots, and as you pull it to there and pivot it, it disengages the internal safeties.
Here we go. Okay. Could you take that from me? I'm showing you gun from States 27. Could you hold that up and show the jury what you're talking about with the trigger?
I'm going to step down or do
Is it okay if I stand there? Yes, please.
So here you can see the profile. There's the trigger, and then this little center area here would pivot. You have to have your finger on that area for the trigger to function. If you were to pull from the side or the extreme top, the trigger will not go completely into the rear, and the firearm will not discharge.
Okay, thank you. Now back to your seat. So, all right. So, is there any type of switch that says safety on any of these Glock models?
No, that is the only external safety you would see on both of these pistols.
Now, can you carry a cartridge, an unfired bullet, inside of the top of the gun? What do you call the top of the gun, where the bullet goes?
The bullet, it goes into the chamber, but the top portion is referred to as the slide.
All right. So can you walk around? Can you essentially load the gun, put the bullet inside of the chamber or a cartridge inside of the chamber, and walk around like that without necessarily killing yourself?
Yes, both of these firearms are designed, you have to pull the trigger. So basically a safety like that would be, a good example is if you drop it. The trigger's not being pulled, it's not going to discharge. You have to manually. You have to have your finger on that trigger safety and pull it to the rear on both of the firearms for them to function.
Now, have you ever done tests about dropping guns to see whether or not dropping makes the trigger go off?
As part of a function exam, we perform impact tests on the firearms, and basically to do that, I'll take a cartridge and I remove the bullet and the powder, and I'm left with what's referred to as a primed cartridge case. I stick that into the chamber, in this case both of these pistols, and then I impacted each one with a rubber mallet. I impacted them multiple times, front, back, top, sides, bottom, and that's to simulate, again, for example, it being dropped, and both pistols pass the impact test portion of the function exam.
So is it common for people that carry guns on them to have the gun ready to fire?
I can't say for certain, but I would believe if you're carrying it, then yes, most likely it would at least be chambered, and then there's essentially either pulling the trigger or turning a safety off, and then pulling the trigger would then get it to function.
And we know reason would tell us, but we know for a fact that both of the sheriff's firearms were in fact with a bullet or cartridge inside of the chamber, and they were ready to fire, right?
I can't tell you how the particular officer carried his or her firearm. I can just tell you how many cartridges and cartridge cases I was given.
Right, so if you, for example, knew that there were okay, so with Deputy Bennett's gun, you had items 34, 35, 36, 37, 38, I guess those are your internal numbers. So there was 5 total cartridge cases, right?
Correct.
And with the magazine, there was a total of, there were 9 cartridges that were given to you as well, right?
Correct.
Okay, so 9 plus 5 is 14.
Yes.
And the magazine for that pistol holds 13.
Correct.
Okay. Now, were you able, on Deputy Bennett's gun, were you able to tell which particular cartridge casing, the empty shell, were you able to tell which one was sitting in his in the chamber of his gun all day, waiting to be fired?
No.
And why is that?
Chambering the cartridge, in theory, could leave marks, but each cartridge would get marked in a similar fashion. There would be no definitive way to tell order, essentially.
And there's no number stamped on them as they come up, right?
Correct.
I want to talk about Mr. Tisdale's gun, which was your item 13, and all the casings and cartridges that you associated to that gun. Are you able to say with any scientific certainty whether or not, when that day started, the magazine was in or out of the gun?
No, I could not tell you.
And if, hypothetically, the magazine was actually inside of the gun, whether or not there was actually a cartridge inside of the chamber?
Meaning, at what point?
So if, for example, the magazine was inside of the cartridge, or, excuse me, assuming that the magazine was inside of the gun, are you able to tell when that first cartridge was placed inside of the chamber to be prepared to fire?
No, I can't tell you that.
So for all intents and purposes, it could have been placed in there the day before,
Correct.
or even a week before.
Correct.
Does, just kind of talking generally, how does being a firearm examiner relate to tool marks?
In reality, firearms identification is a subset of tool mark identification. A tool is basically the harder of two objects that's used to gain mechanical advantage. So if you think about it, a firearm is actually a tool. It's the harder object, and it basically controls the path of the bullet and or cartridge case.
And what other types of, being a tool mark expert, what other types of examinations would you do aside from firearms?
Well, tool mark examinations usually think of items such as, for example, a pair of bolt cutters that maybe someone used to snap a padlock shackle, or we see a lot of screwdrivers that come in that people use to pry open doors. And the theories are the same that I described earlier with class and individual. These tools leave behind class characteristics as well as individual characteristics, or they can leave behind on the objects that they came in contact with. And we do a similar type comparison, trying to connect the marks that were left by those tools back to their respective tools.
So how about something, say, like a running shoe, a sneaker, and walking in sand?
That's another subdiscipline. That would be footwear examinations.
Okay. Do you ever do anything like that?
Yes, that's also part of my duties, to do footwear and tire track comparisons.
I'm sorry?
It's also part of my duty to do footwear and tire track comparisons.
Okay, so for tire tread comparisons, what do you mean by that?
It's basically the track evidence that's left behind at a scene, whether it be from the outsole of a shoe, which is the bottom of the shoe, or the tire itself, the tread. They can leave impressions at the scene, and I can compare either photographs or casts of the impressions from the scene to the actual items itself, or test marks from the items. So, for example, if a pair of shoes comes in, I can make test impressions, compare those test impressions to the photographs of the impressions from the scene. And again, looking for class characteristics, which would be something like size, shape, and tread design agreement, and then individual characteristics. A good example is if there's a chunk of that tread ripped away or missing from the outsole of that shoe. If that characteristic is visible in the impression at the scene and in the test impression I make, then I can connect that particular outsole to the impressions at the scene.
What types of surfaces might you actually look at when we're talking about tires? Like, for example, typical street asphalt. Are you gonna be able to do any type of an examination there?
It depends on whether or not there was some type of impression left that can be collected in some way, shape, or form, either through photographs or casting or alternative methods, meaning there's ways to enhance impressions and then they can be photographed or lifted. So it depends on the situation.
Assuming similar situations, which would be easier or better for you to be able to try to figure out? Tire rolling across asphalt or a tire rolling across sand?
The sand, it should leave some type of three-dimensional impression. That can be, again, it can be photographed, and three-dimensional impressions can be cast, typically in a plaster-type substance, which would be poured over the area, and then lifted and submitted to the laboratory. There can be two-dimensional type impressions left on some type of substrate, whether it be a road or a floor. And depending on what's on the tire at the time, if there's some kind of material that's going to leave something behind that can be, again, photographed or enhanced and photographed, then it could be collected.
Other than the guns and the bullets, basically, were you asked to do anything else in regards to this case?
No.
Okay. No other questions?
I didn't have any redirect.
No redirect.
to be released.
You may.
Okay, the defense to release. Okay, thank you, Mr. Chapman. You're free to go. You're welcome to stay, of course, if you wish. Watch your step.
Your Honor, at this time, the people of the state of Florida will call Julie Tisdale to the stand.
Ms. Casal's come in, please. Thank you for bearing with us. You'll come out here, Commission Road.
Do you swear from the evidence you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Yes, I do.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Would you please introduce yourself to the ladies and gentlemen of the jury?
My name is Julie Tisdale. Casework as well. I had to pass a series of competency tests and proficiency tests in order to become a qualified analyst. And since beginning my career, I've also done continuing education every year.
Have you ever been qualified as an expert in this area of law?
Yes, in forensic biology.
Okay. And where have you been so qualified?
I have testified up here and also down in Dade County as well.
And could you estimate how many times you've been qualified to render an expert opinion in this area in a court of law?
In this area specifically, probably around 20, I would say, probably about 40 times in total.
Now let's talk about the Indian River Regional Crime Lab for a moment if we can. Is that an accredited laboratory?
Yes, our laboratory has been accredited since 2005, and we became internationally accredited in 2012.
Can you explain for the ladies and gentlemen of the jury what accreditation is and how accreditation occurs?
Sure. Accreditation is a voluntary process. Our accrediting body, the American Society of Crime Lab Directors Lab Accreditation Board, actually comes to our laboratory and audits us. They look through our policies and our procedures. They check on our personnel's training and qualifications. They go over all of our procedures and our analysis and just make sure that we're functioning to the highest level possible in the forensic field.
And how often does this accreditation body come in and examine the policies and procedures within your lab?
Specifically, they come every 5 years. However, our section of the laboratory is also audited on a yearly basis.
And what about are you the only analyst that performs this work at the lab, or are there others?
No, there are other DNA caseworking analysts at the lab as well.
All right, and do you folks undergo regular recertification as well?
Every year we're required to do continuing education. We're also required to keep up with scientific literature about new things coming out in the field. We're also proficiency tested twice a year, in which we're given a blind test to perform, and then our answers are looked at in the end to make sure that we've gotten the right answer.
Now, obviously, we're going to get into the procedures that are utilized in conducting these analyses, but can you tell us the instruments that are utilized by the crime lab, what is done to ensure the accuracy and reliability of those from day to day?
We have service contracts on all of our instrumentation, and yearly they receive preventative maintenance. Once that maintenance is performed, we also do performance checks on them to make sure that they're still sensitive and working as they should.
What is a control sample?
We run control samples with our casework. Basically, they're a known sample, and that helps us to see that our instruments are working properly, our kit chemistries are working properly, and also it helps us determine if a contamination event has happened.
All right. So what I want you to do now is just kind of give us all a brief crash course in DNA. What is DNA?
Well, DNA is the genetic material that we receive from our parents at conception. Half comes from your mother and half comes from your father. If we think of ourselves like an egg, the DNA is within the nucleus, which would be the yolk of that egg. In our laboratory, we type 15 different locations on the DNA strand. We'll get a DNA profile from an evidence sample and also a DNA profile from a known sample collected directly from a person and do a comparison between the two. If the samples are different from each other, the profiles we obtain are different, we can exclude somebody as being the contributor of DNA to that sample. But if the profile from the evidence and the profile from the standard are the same, then we can say that we have a match, and we'll perform a statistical calculation to say how rare it is to find someone else who would match that sample as well.
Okay, so when we talk about sources from which the egg, if you will, what are some of the sources of DNA that we have in the human body?
Well, from a forensic standpoint, in the laboratory, we typically see samples that contain blood or semen or saliva. We can also get DNA from skin cells as well.
And how is it that skin cells could be, I guess, deposited on an item? How does that happen just in the ordinary course of human events?
Well, if somebody comes in contact with an object or touches an object, some of their skin will slough off and come onto that object. Within the nucleus of those skin cells is the DNA, and that's the DNA we use to get a DNA profile.
All right. Let's talk about the process that a piece of evidence undergoes during the course of your analysis. You reference an evidentiary sample, you reference a known sample. Can you tell us, first of all, what the difference between the two is?
Sure. Evidence comes from an unknown source, and a standard sample is taken directly from a known source. Typically, if you see on TV, it's when somebody takes a cotton swab and rubs it on the inside of someone's cheek.
That's going to be our known source?
Correct.
All right. Now, let's just say an evidentiary sample is submitted to the crime lab. Take us through the process that you would go through in screening and conducting your initial observations and examinations.
Sure. The exam begins with the serology screening, and that's basically looking at an item to see if it does contain any biological material potentially. So we'll look for areas that contain stains or areas that might have come in contact with a person's skin.
Now, one of the things you talked about just a moment ago is that we can get DNA profiles from somebody's skin cells, correct?
Correct.
Is there, obviously visually you can look at an item and say, okay, that looks like blood. How do you screen for skin cell DNA?
There really isn't any screening tool. I can't use a chemical to tell me, oh, there are skin cells there. It's really based on my training and experience with all of the casework that I worked, and a lot of it also can be common sense. For example, if I'm trying to find out who was holding a hammer, I'll swab that grip area of the hammer because that's where the person was holding it, that's where their skin cells would slough off and remain on the hammer.
So, for instance, if a firearm was submitted to you and you were asked to examine this for purposes of determining whether or not we could recover, usable DNA skin cells, what are some of the places you would swab on a firearm?
Definitely the grip area where the hand would hold the firearm, as well as the trigger area and the trigger safety area. Also the hammer and the magazine can also be sampled for DNA.
All right. So when we focus on skin cells for DNA testing purposes, there are no true screening methods, is that correct?
You can look at a sample underneath a microscope to see if there are any epithelial cells present, and we can also use a staining technique to see. But typically, a sample will just be swabbed during the serology phase, and that swab will go directly to DNA analysis.
Okay, so we jump over to that process and tell us what happens once you've got a swab from an item for which we're testing for skin cell DNA. What's the next step in the process?
The next step is the DNA analysis phase. The analysis begins with the extraction, which is where we break open the cells and break open the nucleus to retrieve the DNA strands from inside. Next, we use a quantitation step, which tells us how much DNA we have present in our sample. We will then amplify that DNA, so we will pick out the 15 specific regions that we're interested in gaining a DNA profile from, and we'll make millions of copies of those specific regions, and finally obtain a DNA profile using a genetic analyzer and a computer program.
Okay. And once you have developed your genetic profile, that is, you have your 15 locations, how is it that you're able to quantify? What is the process involved in quantifying what that tells us?
Well, once we have a profile from an evidence sample, we will do a direct comparison to the DNA profiles that we obtained from our standard samples. And like I had said earlier, if the samples are identical, we can determine them to be a match.
Okay. And so once you have a match between a known sample or a standard and an evidentiary sample, what are you authorized to opine regarding the origin of that evidentiary sample?
We can say that the DNA that's present on the evidence sample came from a certain individual. We'll then also apply a statistical calculation letting us know how rare it is to find somebody in the population that would have that profile.
All right. So let's turn to the evidence in this case. Were you asked by the St. Lucie County Sheriff's Office to examine some items involving the killing of Sergeant Gary Morales?
Yes, I was.
First, I'd like to ask you, did you receive a couple of fired bullets in this case?
Yes, I did.
Let me show you states 80 and 83. Just ask you to, this is, for the record, States Exhibit 80 has been identified as a fired bullet recovered from the passenger door of Sergeant Morales' vehicle. Do you recognize that?
I do. Underneath this tag here is actually handwriting by me. It's the laboratory's case number, my initials, the exhibit number, and the date that I performed this examination. And also you can see that this tape down here has my name and the date of examination where I resealed this package after my exam.
And also, I have here States Exhibit 83. This has been identified as a fired bullet from the dashboard of Sergeant Morales' vehicle, and it's now been identified as having been fired through the defendant's firearm. Do you recognize this? And I would add that this also was identified, 80 as fired through the defendant's firearm.
Yes, again, I have the same markings written on the package by myself, as well as the evidence tape that has my writing on it.
Now, the purpose for which those items were submitted to you was what?
I was asked to examine them to see if they could potentially contain tissue or blood.
And did you find any tissue or blood on those fired bullets?
I did not. I looked at both of these bullets underneath a microscope. I did not see any staining that appeared to be blood or any tissue. I then also took a swabbing separately of each bullet and tested those swabs with the phenolphthalein chemical test to see if they could potentially contain blood, and both results were negative.
All right. And I asked you, does that come as any real surprise to you based upon your training and experience?
From what I saw microscopically, I was not surprised to see that the chemical test was negative. And after I performed my DNA analysis, I did not receive a DNA profile from either of these samples either.
All right. And in your experience, have you had bullets that have been identified as passing through a human body that subsequently were examined and did not show any signs of DNA evidence, blood, tissue, anything of that nature?
I can't recall any specific cases where I've had that. However, I do know that these bullets were retrieved from the car, so anything that occurred while they were removing the bullets could have removed any potential DNA. And also, like I said, microscopically, I did not see any cellular material when I viewed it.
Okay. And I guess ultimately my point is, despite what your findings are, you're not in any position to offer any opinion that these bullets either did or did not come into contact with Sergeant Morales' body. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Let's move to some swabbing. I want to show you States Exhibit 52. This has been identified by crime scene investigator Young as swabbings that were taken from the firearm in the defendant's possession, or recovered from the defendant's vehicle. from the slide grip and so forth. Do you recognize that?
Yes, I do. My writing is on the package as well as my writing on the evidence tape where I resealed this package.
All right. And what is contained within State's Exhibit 52?
This sample was 2 swabs, and I'm quoting, from suspect's weapon.
And what analysis did you conduct or perform on the swab from State's Exhibit 52?
I took a small sample from each of those swabs and performed DNA analysis on them.
And is that the process you referred to, the amplification through the instruments at the crime lab?
Correct.
And let's talk about whether or not there was sufficient quantity of DNA on those samples to develop a full profile.
Yes, there was.
All right. Did you say anything about the sex of the individual that left the profile on the recovered from the firearm?
It was a male profile that I obtained from these gun swabs.
All right. Now, during the course of your examination, were you also provided with a known sample of Sergeant Gary Morales' DNA?
Yes, I was.
And did you submit that to the same testing and develop a full profile for Sergeant Gary Morales?
Yes, I did.
And were you able, do you have an opinion regarding whether or not Sergeant Morales could have been the source of the DNA sample contained in that exhibit before you?
The DNA that I recovered from the firearm was not a match to Sergeant Morales.
So he's absolutely excluded.
Correct.
All right. Let me show you next what's been marked for identification as State's Exhibit 10. This has been identified by Detective Ron Wentz as a DNA swabbing sample taken from the defendant in this case. Do you recognize that?
Yes, I do. My markings are on the package, and my writing is on the sealed evidence tape.
And I would ask, Your Honor, that State's Exhibit 52, I think 52 is in evidence? It is, okay. All right. With regard to the swabbings contained in State's Exhibit 10, were you able to submit this to DNA testing in an effort to develop a genetic or DNA profile?
Yes, I was able to obtain a profile from the sample.
And then with regard to that profile as compared to the profile of the swabbings taken from the defendant's gun, were you able to compare the two?
Yes, I did a comparison between the male profile I obtained from the firearm swabs and the oral swabs taken from Eriese Tisdale.
And based upon your training and experience, do you have an opinion regarding the origin of the samples that were collected from the defendant's firearm as they appeared in State's Exhibit 52?
The DNA obtained from the firearm was a match to the oral sample from Eriese Tisdale.
Now, when you say a match, you said that you're able to develop some type of a number or a statistical probability that the DNA on the defendant's gun that has now been identified as the weapon used to kill Sergeant Morales came from somebody else. What stated in terms of statistical probability, what would that be?
Well, we'll perform a calculation in the lab to see how rare it is to find someone else who could also contain that DNA profile. In this case, it is the odds of finding someone else with the same profile are 1 in 15 quintillion, 240 quadrillion.
How many people, what's the estimated population of the planet Earth at this time?
Approximately 7 billion.
7 billion. So this quadrillion number is considerably larger than the population of the Earth?
15 quintillion, yes.
Thank you, ma'am. I have no further questions.
Mr. Mason?
Hello.
There was some changes to the ways that DNA testing was done in your lab this year?
No, the way we perform DNA testing has been the same for years in our laboratory.
Okay. What was the issue that came up earlier this year regarding the FBI and CODIS?
Our laboratory uses a population database that was created by the FBI back in 1999. At that time, when the numbers for the genetic frequencies were being entered into the computer, there were some errors made. And also, some of the genetic testing that was done was not as sensitive as the tests we're using today. So the FBI discovered this year that some of the profile frequencies that we've been using in our lab to calculate our statistics were slightly off. So our laboratory went back and recalculated our statistics for our casework, specifically for this case.
Thank you very much.
And those recalculated statistics based on the changes to the database resulted in this quadrillion or whatever number you just referred to?
Well, previously, the number was 15 quintillion, 360 quadrillion, and the new calculation was 15 quintillion, 240 quadrillion.
So it's a difference of 400 quadrillion?
Yes.
Whatever that means.
Well,
How many zeros is
approximately.
that? How many quadrillions are zeros?
This particular number would be a 15, comma, 240, comma, and then 15 zeros following it.
Okay. Thank you.
Does you have anything else?
No, sir.
Release her, let her,
Yes, sir, we would. Thank you.
has to release her.
That's fine.
Okay. Thank you, ma'am, very much. You're free to go through the issue while you stay in course. Watch your steps, stepping down, please. Roll call next week.
Yes, sir. Thank you. Your Honor, at this time, the people would call Dr. Roger Middleman to stand.
Thanks for bearing with us. Just watch your step over those wires here.
Do you swear from the evidence you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
Thank you. Just step up there to the left. Watch step.
Good afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon.
Would you please introduce yourself to the ladies and gentlemen of the jury?
I'm Dr. Roger Middleman.
And, sir, how are you presently employed?
I am the District 19 Medical Examiner.
And, sir, how long have you been the District 19 medical examiner?
Since shortly before 2001.
Can you tell us what your jurisdictional area is here in the 19th Circuit?
Yes, it includes St. Lucie, Okeechobee, Martin, and Indian River counties.
And as the district's medical examiner, what are your duties and responsibilities?
We perform death investigations, or autopsies mainly, in circumstances under the Florida Statute 406. In other words, sudden, unexpected death.
All right. And can you give us a description of your educational background, training, and experience in this area of as a medical examiner?
Yes, I went to the University of Miami undergraduate and University of Miami School of Medicine, where I got my BS and MD degree. And then in 1974, I started in a 4-year training course in general pathology, which includes anatomic and clinical pathology. And then in 1979, began at the Miami-Dade County Medical Examiners in a 1-year residency in forensic pathology. I became board certified by the American Board of Pathology in anatomic, clinical, and forensic pathology, and of course I'm licensed in a position in the state of Florida.
Okay. So you're licensed as a physician because you're an MD, correct?
Correct.
First talk to us about what pathology is, and then specifically reference what forensic pathology is.
Okay, well, forensic pathology is one of the basic fields of medicine where doctors make diagnoses from tissue taken out of a body, whether it's in the laboratory, during regular laboratory testing, or surgery to determine whether it's cancerous or not. And then forensic pathology is the application of that to the field of the of the public. In other words, sudden unexpected death. And generally, what we do is that part of the pathology, which is called autopsy pathology, and we determine the cause and manner of death. In other words, whether someone died of a homicide, a suicide, an accident, or just sudden and unexpectedly by natural causes.
In your career, from the time you began down at the Miami-Dade County Medical Examiner's Office through your tenure here in the 19th District, how many autopsies would you estimate you performed?
About 10,000.
Have you ever been qualified as an expert in a court of law in the area of forensic pathology?
Yes.
And how many times and where?
Well, it was in Dade County for the most part, and also here, and in combination about 400 times.
Now we're going to talk about how an autopsy is conducted, but the first thing I'd like to talk about is some of the information that you would rely upon in conducting your autopsy. Is it standard operating procedure, if you will, as a forensic pathologist to take into consideration information gathered out in the field by investigators, witnesses, and so forth?
It can often be dependent on the environment in which a body is found.
Okay. Does it ultimately assist you in rendering opinions regarding cause and manner of death?
Yes.
Will you also on occasion consider such thing as crime scene photographs and investigator reports and things of that nature?
Yes.
All right. Let's move to the autopsy itself. Can you tell us what's the first step in conducting an autopsy?
Okay, well, first of all, the body is brought into the office. It's logged in other words, given a specific case number. Fingerprints are then obtained, and then the body is examined to see if there's any, for example, trace evidence, that kind of thing, depending on the case. And of course, the injuries are examined, rephotographed as necessary. I generate what's called an autopsy diagram, and then after all is said and done, we complete the external examination and then do an internal examination.
Okay, so you start by just examining the body externally, looking for injuries?
Yes.
Why are you taking photographs as this process is going on?
Well, it's to document the evidence, or to document it such that anyone can see what I saw at the time.
All right. And do these photographs also assist you in discussing with the jury or explaining to the jury the cause and ultimately the manner of death?
Yes.
When we talk about manner of death, you touched on it very briefly, but what do you mean when you say manner of death versus cause?
Well, the manner of death is the fashion in which the cause of death occurs. For example, if somebody's shot in the head, is it an accident? Is it a homicide? Is it a suicide? So the cause of death is the same, but the manner of death can be different.
And do the nature of the wounds, the injuries that you might observe during the course of the external examination assist you in identifying cause and ultimately manner of death?
Yes.
Okay, so like for instance, we talk about suicide. If somebody is shot in the head, you could say, I really can't tell, it could be a suicide or a homicide, right?
Right.
But if somebody's shot in the head and also shot in the back of the leg, that might be more indicative of a homicide, correct?
That's correct.
All right. All right, during the course of your external examination, do you also conduct certain measurements, that is height, weight, things of that nature?
Yes.
All right. Let's talk about internal examination. So now, in our hypothetical, we talked about an injury, a gunshot wound to the head, which is readily observable from outside. What do you do in an effort to determine the injuries associated with that individual internally?
Well, we make an incision across the top of the head, and after that we examine the internal aspects of the head. In other words, where the bullet actually went. So that's what we do.
Okay. And, are you able to precisely determine the order in which certain injuries are inflicted on an individual, particularly gunshot wounds?
Usually not.
Okay. What about determinations based upon either a microscopic examination or an internal examination that might lead you to believe somebody was or was not alive at the time the injury was inflicted? Is there a way you can do that?
Well, there are general ways, yes.
Okay, what are those general ways?
Well, for example, if there is blood at the site of an injury, that implies that the heart is still beating at the time the injury is inflicted. So in other words, that would be a sign of a death that occurred, the person was alive, and then of course they're shot and the blood is pumping into the wound.
Okay, and since we're here talking about gunshot wounds, if you examine internally the track of a gunshot wound, are there certain signs that you can observe in the track of the wound of the bullet flight path that might lead you to believe or conclude that the victim was still alive at the time of the shooting?
Yes.
And again, what is that?
Blood in the wound.
All right. Tell the jury what type of information you can glean or gather from an internal examination with respect to the flight path of a bullet through a human body.
Okay, well, we can check the internal organs and see what tissues the bullet actually went through, and therefore be able to see the flight path or the trajectory in the body.
All right. So basically you're identifying the path it takes through, is that correct?
That's correct.
And as a result of that, can you draw certain conclusions regarding the positioning of the victim versus the source of the bullet?
Yes, we can say what's consistent, yes.
Now, are there certain type of telltale signs or injuries associated with a gunshot wound in the body that might reflect deflection or ricocheting within the body?
Yes.
All right, talk to me about that, or talk to the jury about that a little bit.
Okay.
What are those telltale signs?
Okay, well, in general, it's very rare for a bullet to ricochet in a body, and what happens is that bullets generally go in a straight line in the body, in and out, or the bullet may be retained. But what we would look for in terms of a ricochet is a bullet going into the body, hitting a hard surface, and then deflecting in a different way from how the bullet was originally coming in.
Now, is it your experience that you find that, I know you say it's rare, just period, but do you find that more associated with smaller caliber bullets, like 22 caliber versus larger caliber 45, say?
That's correct.
All right. But that's something you can certainly see and take into consideration, is that correct?
Of course.
All right. Now, we've got an external examination. You've identified a gunshot wound entrance point, and can you tell the difference between an entrance and an exit wound?
Yes.
All right, so there are telltale signs that you have come to learn during your career?
Correct.
All right. You've now done the internal examination and established a flight path. Can you tell the ladies and gentlemen of the jury, is there anything that you can do to demonstrate in a photograph that flight path as it would appear through the human body?
Yes.
Okay, tell us how you do that.
Okay, well, normally we do what's called a clarification diagram. In other words, after the autopsy's done and I've made my notes and so forth, I will sit down and take one of the standard diagrams that we use, and I'll draw where the bullet entered and where it went in the body. Just draw a simple diagram.
And then what about in terms of demonstrating it actually in the body? Is there a way that you can do that?
Well, by photographs, of course.
Okay, and what are you using to document the flight path through the body in a photograph?
Well, probes. In other words, we will take a probe, and once we establish what's the entrance point and the exit point, we have various ways of using the probes to demonstrate the flight path in the body.
Okay. All right. And these are photographs?
Correct.
Now, I want to take you to March 1st, 2013, where you were asked to conduct an autopsy on the body of St. Lucie County Sergeant Gary Morales.
Yes.
Can you give the ladies and gentlemen of the jury a physical description of Sergeant Morales?
Yes.
Yeah.
He was 170 pounds, and he measured 5 feet 8 inches.
What I'd like to do is show you some photographs and diagram, and a diagram and I believe an X-ray. Yes. So I'll show you these and I'll just identify the number as you look at them. States Exhibit 91. States Exhibit 92. States Exhibit 93. States Exhibit 94. States Exhibit 95. States Exhibit 96, States Exhibit 97, States Exhibit 98, States Exhibit 99, States Exhibit 100, and State's Exhibit 126. Do you recognize those photographs?
Yes.
Okay, do these photographs truly and accurately depict both the external examination you conducted on Sergeant Morales and then at the conclusion the presence of the probe devices to establish bullet flight path?
Yes.
Okay. Your Honor, I'd offer these exhibits as evidence at this time.
It's out of objection.
No objection.
That objection will be admitted as State's Exhibits 91, 92, 93, 94, 95, 96, 97, 98, 99, 100, and 126.
And Your Honor, if I may have the doctor step down so I can publish the photographs for the jury. Doctor, I'm going to start off with State's Exhibit 91, and I'd ask you to explain to the ladies and gentlemen of the jury what State's Exhibit 91 is.
Okay, well, this is my clarification diagram that I constructed showing the pathway or flight path of 3 gunshot wounds.
So obviously, this is after you conducted your external examination, is that correct?
That's correct.
All right, so for the record, you found a total of how many gunshot wounds on the exterior of Sergeant Morales' body?
Correct.
All right, let's talk first about this particular injury. If you can see up here, describe that particular gunshot wound.
Okay, that is gunshot wound A, and you can see where I've labeled it here on the left side of the head. That's where it entered, and the bullet went through the internal structures, the brain, through the face, and exited through the right cheek area.
And just to be clear, and I think we talked about this a little bit during the lead-up to your testimony, but when you identify a gunshot wound as gunshot wound A, you're not offering any opinion as to the timing of that particular wound, correct?
That's correct.
You have no idea if it was first, last, middle, or otherwise?
Correct.
Okay. Then the next one here is, I believe, B. Can you describe this particular gunshot wound for us?
Yes, that entered the left front of the neck as I'm now pointing, and the bullet then went to the back, and actually the bullet was extracted by a surgeon right over here on the right side. And the passageway included the voice box producing a lot of blood in the airways, and then went through the right carotid artery and also the right jugular vein.
And then finally, gunshot wound, I guess this is C?
Yes, that's it.
Okay, describe just anatomically where that is on the body and what you observed there.
Yes, that's on the left side of the arm, right over the left arm, that is, of course, and that is going downward. It's going through the humerus, which is the main bone in the arm, and then the bullet and fragments is found lodged in about the fracture on the outside fracture.
And the bullet and the fragments recovered from that particular gunshot wound, were they collected and turned over to law enforcement?
Yes.
All right. Now, did you observe any other injuries on or about Sergeant Morales' extremities that would indicate that there is some type of trauma or blunt force in the chest, neck area?
Yes, there was a
Go ahead.
abrasion at the top of the chest. In other words, right over here, and it's kind of curvilinear, right in this general area.
Now, were you made aware of the fact, or are you now aware of the fact that at the time of Sergeant Morales' death, he was wearing a bulletproof vest that had a shock, what they call, I think, a shock plate here in his chest area?
Yes.
Okay. All right. So let's move next to State's Exhibit 92, which is going to be a photograph, an overall photograph of Sergeant Morales. Okay. Is this Sergeant Morales?
Yes, it is.
All right, now we've had an opportunity to speak about the gunshot wound based on your photograph, but the first thing I want to ask you about is this. What is this ruler here for?
Okay, that's just to give an idea of the height of the head and then where the bullets have then I mean, not the bolts, but the wounds are located.
And does this also demonstrate, does this provide us with an objective method of determining the height of Sergeant Morales' torso to the
Yes.
top of his head?
Yes.
Okay, so let's talk about this here first, right there at the center of Sergeant Morales' chest. What kind of an injury is that?
Well, that's an abrasion or rubbing of the skin by, for example, what we discussed.
Okay, so what I want to show you is this shock plate. Okay, doctor, this has been identified as for the record, I'm showing you State's Exhibit 58, as the shock plate that would have sat in the front of his vest. And as you look at that, and you compare it to the location at which it would sit on his body, would that injury that you're seeing there be consistent with the force associated with this impact?
Yes.
Okay. All right. So that obviously would not be characterized or qualified by you as a gunshot wound, correct?
Oh, no.
But it certainly could be an injury associated with a gunshot wound.
Correct.
Okay. Let's next talk about this particular injury here. Go ahead and tell us what that injury is.
Okay, well, I call this arbitrarily gunshot wound B, and this is where the bullet entered the left front of the neck. That's the entrance wound.
And then can kind of see down here, but on this part of the arm, do you see that? What is that?
Well, that would be gunshot wound C, or where that bullet entered.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the last bit of sentence.
That would be gunshot wound C, or where the last bullet entered.
And then finally, which is this?
And that would be gunshot wound A on the left side of the head.
Okay, so let's take them one at a time. This photograph here that you've identified, or excuse me, this portion of the photograph which you've identified as gunshot wound C, right?
Correct.
To the arm, that is the what arm?
That's the left arm.
So State's Exhibit 93. What is that we're looking at there?
We're looking at the entrance for gunshot wound C, which I'm going to point down here on the left side of the arm.
Okay, and just for the benefit of the ladies and gentlemen of the jury, how is it that you're able to say that's an entrance wound versus an exit wound?
Well, in this case, it's easy because there's a bullet in the body, so there's no other choice. Other than that, this has a very rounded appearance, and that's very typical of an entrance wound. And the exit wound is generally more irregular because the bullet is bursting through the skin and tearing the skin at the same time. And in addition, here's the defect here, and then around the defect there is a abrasion where the bullet rubs the skin as it comes in at an angle.
Okay. And then State's Exhibit 126, what are we looking at here?
Well, we're looking at his left arm, and you can see that here's the shoulder up here, clavicle ribs, here's the long bone of the arm, and you can see right before the elbow, there is a fragmentation of that bone, and in addition, you can see fragments of the bullet, which I've recovered.
Okay, so is that bone completely shattered in there as a result of contact with the bullet?
Yes.
And of these, which parts are the bullet and which parts are bone?
Okay, well, the more dense parts of the bullet, for example, here is a big fragment of the bullet, there's another fragment here, there's another one right here, then you get these smaller fragments.
All right. Now, again, I'm going to work on each particular gunshot wound in time, but did you conduct an internal examination of this particular wound?
Yes.
And as a result of that, were you able to opine or to render an opinion regarding directionality or bullet flight path?
Yes.
Let's take a look at State's Exhibit 94. So, go ahead and describe what we're looking at here.
Okay, well, here's the entrance site for the bullet, right where the probe is. And once we open the arm here, there's this incision. This is the muscle of the arm. The bullet was actually found right in this location where the probe is. So we were able to place the probe in the entrance site and then go through the muscle, the shattered bone area, and point to the direction of how the bullet went.
Okay, so if you can step in front of the jury for just a moment and demonstrate on me with my left arm, where approximately would the gunshot wound to Sergeant Morales have entered?
That would be right about here.
Okay. So go ahead and point at it.
Like
Okay. So it's kind of to the top but behind a little bit?
Yes.
All right. And what was the directionality of that particular gunshot wound through Sergeant Morales' body?
Well, it's going from back to front. It's going slightly downward if you consider the body standing like the way I am. And then, of course, it's going from left to right.
Now, what impact would this particular gunshot wound have had on Sergeant Morales' ability to utilize his left arm?
Well, he wouldn't be able to use it. The arm would be, both would be shattered, so he wouldn't be much to do with it.
This particular gunshot wound, would it have necessarily been fatal?
No.
Okay, and when you say no, what could be done, what life-saving measures could be taken to ensure that this particular wound was not fatal?
Well, in other words, obviously when you have an open wound like this, bacteria can get in, antibiotics can be used to avoid any subsequent infection. Bleeding can be stopped with the usual surgical methods, and so it doesn't have to be a fatal wound, certainly not in the acute phase of the event.
Would it have rendered him unconscious?
No.
All right. Would it have rendered him incapacitated in terms of his ability to move other than his ability to use that left arm?
No, he would be okay with that, just that wound.
Okay. So I want to ask you, in just a hypothetical, if you were to assume for the purpose of this hypothetical that Sergeant Morales is seated in the driver's seat of his vehicle, okay?
Yes.
And that as he's attempting to get out of the vehicle, he's stepping out and opening the door with his left hand, and the shooter is approaching from behind the vehicle and discharges the shot. Would the bullet flight path be consistent with that scenario?
Yes.
All right, let's go to State's Exhibit 95. This is going to be the gunshot wound. I forget what number you gave this. What
This
number?
would be B.
This is B?
Correct.
Okay, and can you again tell us were you able to identify a flight path associated with gunshot wound B?
Yes.
First, talk to us about we don't need to show internal photographs, but did you internally examine Sergeant Morales' neck and the wounds associated with this gunshot?
Yes.
Okay, and what internal injuries did this particular gunshot wound cause?
Well, of course, this is a wound to the neck. It's going through the moist box, and then it goes through the right carotid artery, or the main artery going to the brain. It actually transects it, and then goes through the right jugular vein as well in the pathway as it goes down into the right rear of the shoulder area where the bullet was.
Okay, let's take a look at States 96. What are we looking at here?
Okay, we're looking at the rear of the right shoulder or right upper back, if you will, and this is where the surgeon actually moved the bullet.
Okay. And so talk to us about the directionality or the flight path that this bullet took.
Okay.
First, let me ask you, any evidence or indication that as this gunshot wound traveled through Sergeant Morales' body, it was deflected or otherwise ricocheted in any fashion?
No.
Okay, so you have a true flight path?
Yes.
All right, tell us about it.
Okay, this bullet went, of course, from front to back. It went downward, and it also went from left to right.
And again, the wound to the left arm, you also indicated somewhat similar directionality in terms of behind left to right?
Yes.
Let me show States, did you conduct the obviously internal examination, and then did you document this flight path with the dowel?
Yes.
Showing you States Exhibit 97. orient us in this photograph. Tell us what we're looking at here.
Okay, well, we're looking at front of the neck here where the bullet entered gunshot wound B, and you can see that it's going straight to the back where the surgeon recovered the bullet, and obviously it's going to various neck structures in the process.
Okay, now based upon your internal examinations of this particular gunshot wound, are you able to render an opinion as to whether or not Sergeant Morales was alive at the time this injury was inflicted?
Yes, he was alive.
Okay. This particular injury, would it have been immediately incapacitating, or would Sergeant Morales still been capable of some movement?
Yes, he would be able to move, yes.
And again, if you were to assume, as we indicated earlier, Sergeant Morales seated in his patrol car, again, assume an effort to get out or exit the car, and a turning motion, and a shooter coming from the left and somewhat behind, would the nature of that injury be consistent?
Yes.
And then State's Exhibit 98. This particular gunshot wound you indicated was what arbitrary letter did you assign to it?
A.
Okay. And describe where this is anatomically on Sergeant Morales' body.
Well, of course, this is on the left side of the head, and it's directly above the ear.
The fired bullet associated with that gunshot wound, was it recovered during autopsy?
No.
Did it in fact exit Sergeant Morales' head?
Yes.
Let's take a look at State's Exhibit 99. What are we looking at here?
That's the exit side of the bullet.
Okay, now you talked to the jury just a minute ago about what an entrance wound looks like versus an exit wound. Does this kind of demonstrate the difference in the appearance of those wounds?
Yes.
All right. Tell the ladies and gentlemen of the jury what injuries you associated with this particular gunshot wound to the left side of Sergeant Morales' head.
Okay, well, it went inside the skull, and it went through the left cerebral hemisphere, and then it went through the bone at the base of the skull into what's called the maxillary bone and cheekbone on the right side, and exited from the lower portion of the same.
Now again, I ask you the same question I asked with respect to the gunshot wound to Sergeant Morales' neck. Any evidence of deflection or ricocheting associated with that particular gunshot wound?
No.
That you have a direct flight path associated with that wound?
Correct.
Talk to us about whether or not that particular gunshot wound would have been immediately incapacitated.
Yes, it would.
Okay, when you say that, that's sometimes we might use an analogy of the lights out type situation, is that correct?
Correct.
Okay, would Sergeant Morales any longer be capable of any conscious movement, if you will?
No.
Okay, what would happen to his motor functions and his body when that particular gunshot wound was inflicted to the left side of his head?
It would stop in terms of any purposeful motion. Any place gravity would take it, though, that's where it's going to go.
Okay, so assuming what direction he was moving at the time, it would continue to fall in that direction when he lost control of his muscles.
Correct.
As you examined the flight path of that particular bullet to the left side of Sergeant Morales' head, again, were you able to discern whether or not his heart was beating at the time that injury was inflicted?
Yes, it was.
All right. And again, with regard to this particular bullet and establishing the flight path, how did you go about doing that?
We put in a probe where it entered and where it exited after, between examination.
Okay, so initially you removed the skull cap, examined the brain, then you put it back and put the probe in.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's take a look at State's Exhibit 100. Okay, that photograph, what are we looking at here?
We're looking at the probe that went in the entrance site for gunshot wound A, went into the vault of the skull, went through his face, through the cheekbone, and exited right there.
Okay, and again, can you tell us what the flight path of that particular bullet would do?
Well, it's going from left to right, it's going slightly forward, and it's going, of course, downward.
Okay, and again, consistent with the general flight path of the other two gunshot wounds that we've discussed?
Oh, yes, except remember the arm will come back to the...
Okay.
Thank you.
Right. So again, if we were to assume the same chain of events, assume all of the facts we've discussed about the turning motion, if Sergeant Morales were exiting or attempting to exit the car, and the shooter, again, coming from behind, were to fire a shot from above and behind, would the flight path of this particular bullet be consistent with that?
Yes.
You can retake your seat. Thank you. With respect to all three gunshot wounds that you identified, Doctor, is it fair to say that each of them came from left to right on Sergeant Morales' body?
Yes.
All right. Also, that they were all slightly downward as well.
Yes.
Okay, which again would indicate the relationship between Sergeant Morales, wherever he might have been, and his shooter as being below the shooter.
Correct.
All right. Stated to a reasonable degree of medical certainty, do you have an opinion regarding the cause of Sergeant Gary Morales' death on February 28, 2013?
Yes.
And what is the cause of his death?
Multiple gunshot wounds.
And do you have an opinion stated to a reasonable degree of medical certainty as to the manner in which Sergeant Morales was killed?
Yes.
And what is that?
Homicide.
Thank you, sir.
Richard?
Aye.
I just wanted to start by kind of clarifying something first. When is somebody actually considered dead as far as they're concerned? Is it when they're, just so I can clarify, is it when their heart stops beating or when their brain stops working?
Well, it's the brain in particular in a clinical sense. In other words, when somebody's declared brain dead.
I want to talk to you first about gunshot wound A that's the one to the head, correct?
Correct.
And you do consider this to be a fatal wound?
Yes.
Do you believe that when this fatal wound occurred, that death was instantaneous?
In terms of the brain, yes, but the heart can still keep pumping.
So if his brain is instantly dead, would he have been able to have felt any pain or discomfort if this was the first shot?
No.
And instantaneously, his ability to feel pain or discomfort would be removed?
Correct.
I want to talk to you about gunshot wound B, the one that went to his neck. If this were the only shot, do you believe that this would also be a fatal wound?
Well, it's a very, very serious wound, and it's extremely lethal.
So death would not have been instantaneous with this particular gunshot, correct?
Well, in the sense that his brain would keep functioning, however, vital vessels have been perforated and such, and obviously he's going to lose consciousness fairly quickly with that type of wound, and then his brain would be irreversibly affected, of course, very quickly.
And by you saying relatively quickly, he would have been unconscious if this were just the only shot. Approximately, if you could give us an approximate amount of time that you would expect that a person would be unconscious with these injuries from gunshot wound be?
It would be a very short period of time. We have blood that's going right in his airways, suffocating him. We have blood coming out of his neck as well, causing a decreased oxygenation of the brain. It's hard to get a precise moment, if you will, but I would say that unconsciousness would occur quickly, probably in less than a minute.
And during that time, that say minute that you're approximating, would, if this were, hypothetically, if this were the only shot, with this type of loss of blood, and on the way to unconsciousness, is the person still able to think completely clearly, or do they have any type of loss of sensation at all?
Well, I mean, he'd know he was shot in terms of blood coming out. Obviously, you would see it. I think that with the blood loss, it would be very rapid, and although he might think clearly for several seconds and so forth, he would start to lose his consciousness quickly.
And would potentially sensation be dulled?
As he's passing out and so forth, yes.
And sensation would, of course, include pain and discomfort, correct?
Right.
Were you able to make any type of determination as to the minimum distance away the gun would have been from his body?
Well, I didn't see any gunpowder. That's one of the things that we look for. Of course, clothing can block out gunpowder in particular, but in terms of the wounds by themselves, I didn't see any sign of any type of powder transfer.
And when you're talking about powder transfer, could you tell the jury a little bit more about that and what that would entail?
Okay, well, when a bullet comes out of a gun, not only does the bullet come out, but also gunpowder comes out. We have two areas of the body, in this case, where this powder, if the muzzle's close enough to the surface of the skin, within, say, a few feet, it would be deposited around the wound, what we call tattooing or gunpowder stippling, or if it's a contact, obviously it would be a ring at or about the entrance site. I didn't see any of that for the head wound or the neck wound. Of course, the arm wound could have clothing there, but I didn't see any powder or stippling. Sometimes it goes right through the sleeve of the shirt. So generally, when we're talking about powder, you have to be a few feet away, 1 to 2 feet away, and then it starts to fall off and you don't see it after that distance. So it doesn't, these are not close wounds as far as I could tell.
All right, thank you very much, Doctor. I have no other questions for you.
And again, the close, as you discussed, close, it's 1 to 2 feet is what you're talking about, is generally depositing gunshot residue.
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much, sir.
Yes.
I appreciate it.
Commissioner, anything else, Dr. Middleton?
No other questions, thank you.
There he goes.
He would be released at this time.
Release it. Thank you, doctor. You're free to go.
Thank you.
You're welcome to stay, of course. If you wish to stay. Let me have an approach real quickly before we continue. Folks, thank you all for your attention. We'll stop for the afternoon. If I can have y'all come back at 8:45 tomorrow down to the jury assembly room, I will also bring y'all up. Please don't discuss the case among yourselves. Allow anyone to discuss in your presence or make any opinions as to the merits of the case, and please not re-elicit immediate counsel until after your motion is finished. Thank you all very much. You're free to go. You have a nice evening. We'll see you tomorrow morning. Okay, thank you all very much. You'll come back at 8:45.
Should we take up a couple things before we break?
Yes, sir.
The first is, again, I've said this now several times, but when these reports occur, we're reporting listed as Natasha Powers as a witness in an effort to avoid a continuance. I said I would conduct her deposition in the middle of trial. I was told originally that that could happen tonight. I had the court reporter available to come over to my office and conduct that. I've now been informed that she's not available tonight. I was willing to come in early in the morning to conduct it. They've indicated she's flying in at 6 o'clock, or she's leaving Colorado at 9 o'clock or 6 o'clock and won't be available until she gets here tomorrow sometime afternoon. So again, I just want the court to be aware for scheduling purposes. I think I have a right to conduct discovery in this case. I think the defendant's delay in adding witnesses, whether intentional or otherwise, is affecting my ability to adequately be prepared. I need to not only depose this person who has a very colorful history, I need to get that deposition transcribed. Because quite frankly, I'm not really sure what she has to say is even relevant or admissible. Number two, I have asked now, quite frankly I asked back a year ago maybe, or more, that the defense comply with the Rule of Criminal Procedure 3.202. I asked again at the beginning of trial, I asked just the other day, and here I sit on the eve of a verdict in this case, having to move to the penalty phase, and they have not complied with the Rules of Criminal Procedure. And I can assure you that if that was a state doing that, there'd be bloody murder being screamed in this courtroom. So I want to just get it on the record again. I want some kind of acknowledgement that they're going to comply with, 3.202, subsection B. It says as follows. When in any capital case in which the state has given notice of intent to seek death, I ask the court to take judicial notice of the fact, we filed our notice of intent to seek death the day I indicted him. And that under subdivision A of this rule, it shall be the intention of the defendant to present during penalty phase of the trial expert testimony of a mental health professional, they've got two of them now, who have tested, evaluated, or examined the defendant. Both of these experts have flown in, they have met with the defendant, they have examined him, and partially through the deposition of one of them. In order to establish statutory or non-statutory mental mitigating circumstances, the defendant shall give written notice of the intent to proceed such evidence, and they must identify those as well. And I don't have that notice. And we are now potentially a week away from the penalty phase. So I would ask the court to direct the defense to comply with the Rule of Criminal Procedure.
Okay. Defense.
Your Honor, I'll address that. Basically, Judge, we don't feel that there's anything we have not complied with. We have complied with it. We don't have any mental health mitigation that would fall under that specific rule that we will be presenting. And that's our position.
Okay. Mr. Hackall, does that answer that question?
No. I mean, so let them, they have a psychologist who examined the defendant. I mean, they are mental health professionals. Clearly, one of these guys is going to come in and one of the guys wrote the book on how you conduct a mental health examination.
That's not what I understood. Are y'all not going to present this testimony?
We're not presenting mental health. That's not what they're testifying to, Judge. And we've communicated that to Mr. Bassett on numerous occasions.
What is it they're testifying to?
Other things.
Ask them what their professions are.
First, let's, wait a minute, just, what are their names? Have they been disclosed by the defense?
Yes, Your Honor.
What's their names?
Dr. Mark Cunningham and Dr. James Garbarino.
I'm sorry, the second gentleman's name was Garbarino?
Yes, Your Honor.
All right, so they're not testifying as to mental health issues as contemplated by that rule?
That's correct, Your Honor.
And they've been disclosed by the defense?
Yes, Your Honor.
Do you know about when they were disclosed?
No, Judge, I don't really know when they were disclosed. I do know that Dr. Cunningham's deposition has been concluded by the state, and Dr. Garbarino's deposition was begun by the state. Has not been concluded, but was begun prior to trial.
And these are potential penalty phase witnesses if
That's correct, Your Honor.
necessary?
If we get to penalty phase, these would be penalty phase witnesses.
Back it off, you deposed Dr. Cunningham?
Yes, we conducted his deposition. Dr. Cunningham is an individual who actually, I don't have the book with me, but wrote a book on mental health evaluation for capital cases. He actually attempted or began to render certain opinions regarding the defendant's background and so forth, but my understanding is the defense intends to offer him on an issue of future dangerousness, which would require him to draw upon his experiences in the mental health field, and more particularly, as evidenced by the rule, he tested, evaluated, or examined the defendant. And so his ultimate opinion in the case is based in part on that. Dr. Garbarino, quite frankly, he is in fact, I said, you're not a psychologist. He took great umbrage to that. He took issue with the fact that I suggested he wasn't a psychologist, and because what he said was, I train psychologists. I mean, he wrote the book on talking to killers. He's another death penalty abolitionist who they've hired to testify based upon examinations of the defendant, and considering his background and other information of that nature, that there are certain non-statutory mitigators. He met with the defendant, he evaluated the defendant, and he's going to render certain opinions. Now, I don't know what the ultimate opinion will be, because again, I haven't finished that deposition. But it's just absolutely unbelievable that they could stand before you as officers of the court and not acknowledge that these are mental health professionals.
When are you going to finish Dr. Garbarino's deposition?
That's a good question, Judge, because I don't know exactly. Remember, I had asked from a long, long time ago, I said I would like 1 week between the end of the guilt phase and the penalty phase, because I've got to get my expert in. I've got to finish these depositions, because Garbarino was also a last-minute add-on by the defense. So I'm going to do it in that period of time between the rendering of the verdict and the beginning of the guilt phase. So I don't know, when that is. I don't know yet, but soon, I hope.
What is it you're asking me to do?
I'm asking, Your Honor, I'm just asking you to tell them to comply with the rules of criminal procedure. I mean, that's all I'm asking. I just want to make sure all the rules apply equally in this courtroom. And that's what I'm asking.
Ms. Miranda, anything else you wish to say?
Judge, unfortunately, I do feel like I need to respond to one thing, and that is that I disagree with the state's position that Dr. Garbarino took umbrage to being called, said to the state, referring to him as not being a psychologist. I think clearly the testimony in his deposition explains that there are different types of psychologists, like there are different types of doctors. Not all handle the same things, not all have expertise in the same areas, and so I don't think he took umbrage to it. I think he really explains what the differences were in his profession. Again, Judge, I don't think we have not followed the rules of criminal procedure. In this case, if anything, that's what we have done. And in this case, the rule simply does not apply, and that's why we have not filed a notice.
Y'all can bear with me just a minute, please. right, so let me make sure I understand. The defense is announcing today that either Dr. Cunningham or Dr. Gabarino are not going to be presented to establish statutory or non-statutory mental mitigating circumstances. Is that right?
Right, Your Honor, they will not be testifying as to any mental health.
Mitigating circumstances.
That's correct.
Okay. Well, the rule requires 3.202, which under paragraph A requires the state to give a written notice of its intent to seek the death penalty. Paragraph B says when in any capital case in which the state is given notice of intent to seek the death penalty under subdivision A of this rule, it shall be the intention of the defendant to present during the penalty phase of the trial expert testimony of a mental health professional who has tested, evaluated, or examined the defendant. In order to establish statutory or non-statutory mental mitigating circumstances, the defendant shall give written notice of intent to present such testimony. Under paragraph C of that same rule, it says the defendant shall give notice of intent to present expert testimony of mental mitigation not less than 20 days before trial. The notice shall contain a statement of particulars listing the statutory and non-statutory mental mitigating circumstances the defendant expects to establish through the expert testimony and the names and addresses of the mental health experts by whom the defendant expects to establish mental mitigation insofar as is possible. Now, I don't know anything about these witnesses' testimony, of course. I suppose, because I know nothing of what their testimony will be, I can't determine whether it's mental, statutory or non-statutory mental mitigating circumstances. I guess I'll have to determine that at a later date. If it is, if their testimony is determined to be statutory or non-statutory mental mitigating circumstances and no notice has been given pursuant to this rule, I reserve the right to take whatever appropriate action is necessary. If it's not statutory or non-statutory mental mitigating circumstances, then no notice is required as I understand that rule. So y'all can read the rule as well as I can. Perhaps better. It's not hard to understand. Whatever rule or procedure it is, y'all are expected to comply with it. So without knowing what it is they're going to testify to, I can't take any other action. But I guess I'll determine the nature of their testimony when I hear it. So, but Mr. Bagdahl, if you'll try and complete Dr. Gabarino's deposition, maybe we'll have a little bit better idea.
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'll be here at 8:45, please.